I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, some revealing testimony that exposes a truth behind the BDS movement. The United States House of Representatives Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade held hearings in Washington, and one of those called before the committee was Jonathan Schanzer, a name you should get to know, Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan Schanzer is vice president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And Jonathan presented to Congress compelling evidence of a financial link between BDS and Hamas. Jonathan Schanzer showed how those involved in the BDS movement here in America are a main source of funding for the terrorist organization. Now, this story has been written about in a brilliant column by one of American Jewry's leading journalists, Jonathan Tobin, the senior online editor of Commentary magazine. And to discuss his piece and the implications of Jonathan Schanzer's congressional testimony, I'm pleased to have on our JBS phones Jonathan Tobin. Jonathan, thank you for making some time for us once again.
It's great to be with you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Jonathan, I really hope our viewers take the time to go to the Commentary website, the archive, to find your piece. But take a moment to explain how you show that Jonathan Schanzer traced money from an American organization, American Muslims for Palestine, that's a key sponsor of Students for Justice in Palestine, the leading anti-Israel BDS network on college campuses, as well as money going to Hamas.
It's pretty simple to connect the dots here, and credit goes to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and my friend Jonathan Schanzer, who spoke about it before Congress, as you said. Now, what it boils down to is this: go back more than 15 years ago, and into the late 1990s, there was a group called the Holy Land Foundation.
Yes.
It was based in Dallas, and it was founded as a front group for fundraisers for Hamas. And it raised money in the United States among American Muslims and anybody else that they could get money from, that went directly to Hamas causes and Hamas-related activities in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. Direct funding. At the time, that was actually legal, believe it or not. And not until the United States Congress passed a law forbidding the funding of terrorist activities abroad in the United States did it run afoul of the law.
Yes.
At that point, the United States Treasury investigated, and ultimately the Holy Land Foundation was shut down. And one of the interesting sidebars to that prosecution was that we learned that the group, the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, which is to this day one of the most prominent spokespersons, those groups that purport to represent American Muslims to the rest of the country, was founded by these very same people who were involved with the Holy Land Foundation, and it was intended to be their political front group. Mm-hmm. While others raised money directly that went directly to terrorism groups, a group that murdered Israelis and Americans, anybody they could get their hands on, via suicide bombings, shootings, you name it. So the people behind this group, why are we talking about it in terms of BDS? Because the same people that were involved in the fundraising and the organization of the Holy Land Foundation are now involved in another group called, American Muslims for Palestine, that is fundraising for a different cause, and that's for BDS groups on college campuses across the country and anywhere else, and they're funneling money now to because that's legal. Sending money to Hamas is not legal, gets them in big trouble, but it's legal for them to fund BDS. Now, you have to ask a couple of questions about this. If BDS is such a human rights cause, as its opponents claim it to be, as its Jewish proponents claim it to be.
Yes.
As many members of Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the most prominent, as you noted, BDS group. Now, let's stop ourselves for a moment. What do we mean by BDS? BDS stands for Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, and it's aimed at Israel. And its goal is to get all American institutions, be they scholarly and especially American universities, to divest from any companies that do business in Israel, divest from anything related to Israel, not to allow Israelis to study there or to have agreements with Israeli institutions. In other words, to wage economic warfare on the Jewish state and on its citizens. And this group, as I said, these people who were involved in Holy Land Foundation funding of Hamas are now funding BDS.
Yes.
So we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Number one, what is BDS up to? What do they really want?
Mm-hmm.
Number two, why are these Hamasniks funding it? And of course, the answers are pretty clear. The Hamas supporters are funding it because they see it as war by other means against Israel. It's a continuation of their effort to destroy the Jewish state. And this is a complete contradiction of the line that we get from BDS supporters and sympathizers and those who claim that it's not anti-Semitism, which is an important issue which we have to touch on. It clearly is. This is not a human rights effort. BDS is not about moving Israel's borders, about being against settlements or opposing the Netanyahu government. It's about war on Israel. Mm-hmm. And the proof is in the pudding.
Yes.
Not really in what it wants to do, but by who is funding it.
Fascinating analysis. And again, you do a superb job of outlining that in your piece. Jonathan, you know that many American Jews argue, and you cite this in your piece when you quote Peter Beinart, that a pro-Israel Jew who loves Israel can also be against Israel's occupation of the West Bank and try to use the BDS movement to change Israeli policy to, from their perspective, better conform with Jewish values. You argue that you see a definite link between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism, which again you touched a moment ago. I want you to elaborate on that and whether and how you respond to individuals who say to you, hey, Jonathan, are you suggesting I'm anti-Semitic or even anti-Israel because I want the occupation to change and I want to bring any kind of pressure I can on Israel to change the occupation policy?
Well, let's make some very clear distinctions. You don't have to be in favor of West Bank settlements. You don't have to be a fan of Benjamin Netanyahu, his government, the Likud, or really be invested at all in the current Israeli government in order to understand that BDS is not about any of those things. Mm-hmm. It's very clear BDS is about sanctioning all of Israel. It's about isolating Israel, like the entire country. It's about economic warfare on the entire country. Its goal is not adjusting Israel's borders any more than Hamas's goal is adjusting Israel's borders. There is a lively and important debate that goes on within Israel about what the future of the territory should be, what Israel's stance should be on the peace process. I might add parenthetically that is an argument that Israelis are having, and for the moment, at least in the last 3 elections, they've spoken. The majority of Israelis feel that there is no partner for peace. Mm-hmm. Indeed, the head of the Labor Party, the head of the opposition to Netanyahu, says there's no partner for peace right now, and that there's no point in talking about a 2-state solution until the Palestinians are ready to make peace, mm-hmm. which really cuts the legs out from under the argument that BDS can help make Israel change, make it conform to Jewish values. The majority of the Israeli people would probably be in favor of withdrawal from most of, if not all of the West Bank.
Of course.
But they're not going to do what they did in Gaza in the West Bank. And in 2005, it's worth repeating that Israel withdrew every settler, settlement, and soldier from Gaza in the
Yes.
hope that this would lead to peace. And instead, it became an independent Palestinian state in all but name, ruled by terrorists, and just a big terror launching pad for rockets, terror tunnels, and the idea of repeating that, replicating that experiment in the much larger, more strategic West Bank against Israel's, which abuts Israel's population centers, strikes the vast majority of Israelis, including many who do not like Netanyahu, as not merely a wrong-headed policy, but insane, just not something that any Israeli government is going to do. So this idea that Israel could be influenced by economic pressure to do something that the majority of its people understand to be an irrational policy makes no sense. What BDS is aimed at is isolating all of Israel, just as Israel's enemies make no distinction between the most remote West Bank settlement on a hilltop and that settlement along the Mediterranean known as Tel Aviv.
Yes.
That's the issue here. BDS is not about West Bank settlements. It's about Israel itself. It's about the Jewish state. And when we speak, and of course, you can be against settlements. You can support those people in Israel who are working against Netanyahu. But in order to advance that cause, to advance the cause of peace, you don't tell the Palestinians, hold tight. We're with you. We've got your back, and we're going to isolate Israel until it bows down, until it bends to your demands. That doesn't advance the cause of peace. Now, in terms of anti-Semitism, it's very important to understand here. Of course, you can criticize Netanyahu. You can criticize any Israeli government, just as we criticize our own government without being against the state of Israel, without being anti-Semitic, just as you can criticize whoever our president is, whether it's George Bush or Barack Obama, without being anti-American. But let's understand something. Those who treat Israel differently from any other country in the world, those who are anti-Zionist and say that Israel should not exist as a Jewish state, those who would deny the Jewish people a state in their ancient homeland, something that they would not do to any other people in the world. No other people is called upon to give up sovereignty in their own country. No other nation is treated this way. Only the one Jewish state on this planet. Mm-hmm. Now, that is an act of discrimination. It's an act of bias because you're just not doing it to anybody else. There are lots of other countries where there are issues, where there are clear human rights abuses that dwarf the minimal complaints that can be made against Israel. And nobody calls for their dissolution. Nobody calls for them to be disbanded and replaced by something else. So what you're doing here by being against Zionism, by saying Zionism is illegitimate, you're discriminating against the Jewish people. And discrimination against the Jewish people, well, the term of art for that is anti-Semitism. Yes, and I make no bones about saying that anti-Zionists are practicing a form of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And indeed, as we look at their behavior, the BDS advocates who are against Israel, not just against West Bank settlements, and we see in various examples all across the country, again and again, they get caught making anti-Semitic statements. I mean, just the other day, the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine at Harvard Law School stood up at an event where Tzipi Livni, the head of one of the opposition parties to the Netanyahu government, and basically called her a smelly Jew. Yes. And then proclaimed that no, I'm not doing anything anti-Semitic by using old stereotypes and engaging in insults like that. Well, we know what you're doing, and we know why you're doing, and we're not fooled by it. So there is a clear continuum between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and indeed it would not have the fervor, it would not have the support that it has without being backed up by this mania, this virus of hate that is anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm.
Now, you've made the point that at one point what those who were supporting Hamas were doing was not illegal, but it is today. What do you think the repercussions are going to be for Shanzer's exposing the economic link? And Jonathan, there's something just frightening, startlingly frightening about the fact that there are American groups literally funding a terrorist organization intent on, as you just said, not changing borders, but eliminating the state of Israel. What do you expect to come out of this?
Well, I'm not going to tell our audience, I'm not going to feed you mindless optimism here. We have to understand the nature of this struggle. And it's not one necessarily between fair-minded people. Those who embrace the cause of BDS, those who are anti-Zionist, they make common cause with Israel's enemies, with Israel's enemies who commit terrorism. And I'm not incredibly optimistic that the leaders of Students for Justice in Palestine are suddenly going to wake up and understand that they've gotten into bed with Hamas people, with people who support Hamas. And that's because I'm not entirely sure that they don't support Hamas, or at least some of them don't.
Mm-hmm.
That at least they sympathize with Hamas terrorism. And just again, a reminder for our audience, the Hamas position is that all of Israel is occupied territory, not just the West Bank, not even parts of Jerusalem, but all of it, Tel Aviv, Haifa, you name it. And in fact, that is a position, I would say, sadly, that is implicitly endorsed even by the head of the moderates, the Fatah, the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who said recently that he regarded all of Israel as having been occupied since 1948.
Yes.
So, we have a real problem here, and that's the culture of intransigence, the culture of denial of any rights for the Jews to any part of the country. And indeed, Abbas, like Arafat before him, has repeatedly refused peace offers because he cannot, or will not, recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state, no matter where its borders.
Exactly.
So when we ask ourselves, are Students for Justice in Palestine going to wake up and not get involved with these people? No, I don't think so. And I have to say, I'm not terribly optimistic with some of their Jewish partners, the people behind a group like Jewish Voices for Peace, which is also pro-BDS and anti-Zionist. We have to understand that these people have sort of crossed that Rubicon.
Yes.
Where I do hope it has at least a little impact is on those who are in the, shall we say, in the orbit of these groups. Students and professors and sort of general liberals who are supporters of groups like J Street and who regard BDS not necessarily as the worst thing in the world. We want to wake them up to the fact that this is a real conflict. This is not human rights activists versus an oppressive Israel. These are groups that are anti-Semitic, that support terrorism, and to understand that the struggle against BDS is not a tired old cliche that the organized Jewish community is trying to shove down their throat. Rather, it is the moral issue of our time.
Yes.
For anyone who cares about Israel, anyone who cares about their Jewish identity, or indeed decent people everywhere, no matter what their religion might be.
The moral issue of our time. Good for you. By the way, I told you before we began, Jonathan, I thought your piece was not only beautifully written, it was very courageous because you were willing to name names and you were willing to ask questions in your piece, which you then answer, which sometimes the Jewish community wants to sort of avoid. And specifically, I want you to talk to me about Peter Beinart. And this is not because I want to pick on Peter, and Peter's been a guest of here on JBS a number of times. I happen to like him very much personally, and I believe, Jonathan, he is a very committed Jew. All his kids go to day school, they go to Heschel, and he has Israeli flags in his home. And at the same time, you write about how Peter depicts people who are for the BDS movement as hearing the voice of Sinai. You quote him. Which he says is a metaphor for a vision of Jewish law, values, and law. And I'm using him, therefore, as an example. What do you say to the Peter Beinarts in the Jewish community who honestly consider themselves to be pro-Jewish, pro-Israel? They don't want Israel to go out of existence. They do understand that Hamas is not talking about the West Bank. Hamas is talking about Tel Aviv and Haifa and Caesarea, etc. And you are correct. I hope everybody heard you. The reality is that the Fatah, which is the successor to the PLO was created not after the Six-Day War. The PLO was created before the Six-Day War, before Israel ever had a foot on the West Bank, and what it was trying to liberate, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was Israel proper. But I want to know what you say if you were in conversation with a Peter Beinart, who you describe, and you describe his argument very well. What would you say to him?
Well, listen, a disclaimer first. Of course, I know Peter Beinart too. I'm not accusing him of being anti-Semitic or being anti-Israel.
Absolutely.
That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that Peter has an approach to this conflict which does not recognize its seriousness, which gives too much credit to those who have crossed the line over into anti-Zionism. He and I have an argument about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I think he's dead wrong. And as I said just a few minutes ago, I think it's clear that there is no doubt that anti-Zionism is discrimination against Jews. It is an act of anti-Semitism. He doesn't want to view it that way. And I understand why he and many other American liberals who have who have this need, as perhaps in some ways all of us do, to see the other side as being inherently reasonable and compromise being something that we could, if we try hard enough, to arrive at, if we make enough concessions, if we care enough, that we can somehow magically make peace by ourselves and without the support of the Palestinians. And I think he's just wrong. He's wrong about that overall issue about he's wrong to say that Israel can be saved from itself. I think there's a certain hubris in American Jews thinking that they have a better idea of Jewish values and a better idea of the realities of the Middle East than the vast majority of the Israeli people that have rejected such notions, at least under the current circumstance. I think this is very foolish. And I think it's also foolish not to be willing to look the other side in the face and call them by their right names.
All right, I want you to address one more issue. And again, this could be a topic of an hour discussion, but we only have a few minutes left. You quoted that it was Boogie Herzog, Isaac Herzog, who heads the Labor Zionist Party, and he is the opposition leader in the Israeli Knesset. And what he said was that even had he been elected, there's no one to make peace with at the present time. And the vast majority, it's not a left-right issue anymore in Israel. The overwhelming sentiment across the spectrum in Israel is, we would make peace in a heartbeat, we'd give up land in a heartbeat, but we would only do it for a peace equivalent to Canada and the United States living in peace with one another. And at the moment, there's nobody on the Palestinian side ready to do that. And we could discuss why, but that's not my question at the moment. My question at the moment is that there tends to be a definition of left and right in the Jewish world. The left is associated with the kind of movements you've discussed, and the right is who you're branded, Jonathan, as being on the right, and Netanyahu's on the right. And if you're a Jew in America and you're against making peace with an enemy that has sworn your destruction, you're on the right too. I'm arguing that the center is very large now, and that it's inappropriate for the left to say, if you are against the two-state solution in the current climate, you're on the right. Now, I know that you are part of the conservative Jewish community. I want you to speak to how you feel about this left-right divide.
It's an important point, Mark, because the old left-right arguments about Israel, pro-settlements, anti-settlements, I've been taking part in these things,
forever,
my life.
Forever.
But the point about them is that that argument is outdated.
Yes.
It's irrelevant. Both the left and the right in Israel have, in a sense, cracked up. The idea that Israel can hang on to all of the West Bank indefinitely, can settle all of it, and that the Palestinians will either go away or acquiesce to it, this idea that there can be a greater land of Israel with no cost and no price to be paid, which was sort of the myth of the right. Well, that cracked up. That ended with the First Intifada and the Oslo Accords. Very few people in Israel really believe that. Even on the parties to the right of Likud, even they were ready to make some sort of compromises along those lines. On the other hand, the belief of the traditional left, the peace camp, that if Israel is only nice enough to the Palestinians, they will make peace. They will, the lion will lie down with the lamb, as Shimon Peres said famously in his 1994 book. There'll be a new Middle East peace where Israel and the Palestinians will become like Belgium and the Netherlands. This idea equally cracked up, and it cracked up very noisily in the terrorism of the 1990s, and then ultimately in the horror of the Second Intifada. There is very little constituency in Israel for either the traditional positions of the left and the right. They're past it.
Yes.
They're past it because, unlike most American Jews, and indeed much of the Democratic Party, certainly as evidenced by President Obama, Vice President Biden, Senator Bernie Sanders, not so much Hillary Clinton these days. Most Israelis understand that there isn't going to be a peace process with people who don't want peace. And until there is a sea change in the political culture of the Palestinians that will enable some Palestinian leader to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state, as I said, no matter where its borders would be drawn, then there's nothing to talk about. There is no peace, and that all they can do is to manage a conflict, make it as livable as possible for both sides until peace is possible. That's realism. There is no more left and right in any real sense along those lines, because as I said, if even the head of the Labor Party understands that there is no peace to be had with the Palestinians, what are we talking about? What are the Peter Beinarts and even President Obama and Vice President Biden waiting for? What do they expect? And in essence, they are placing themselves against the wisdom and the knowledge that the overwhelming majority of the Israeli people, whether they like Netanyahu or not, understand, because they're paying attention to what's been going on the last 20 years. Well, unfortunately, much of American Jewry are clinging to their illusions and the misstatements and the really distortions about the conflict that they get in much of the American media. And thus they take unrealistic positions, and often positions that put themselves really on the wrong side of the line with people who have very different intentions towards Israel and the Jewish people.
Jonathan, I could talk to you forever. We have not exhausted this topic. Again, I recommend people read your piece on the commentary website. It is a courageous piece, beautifully written, and you always articulate very well. It's not, from my perspective, about left and right over this issue. This issue is, how does one express a support for Israel that allows, as you've suggested, the American Jewish community to let the people of Israel, this is people, this is bright, sensitive people who are doing the best they can in an impossible situation, that we allow them some room, and that what we do is simply try to understand and support them as much as possible. I thank you for always giving me time, my friend. We will talk again very soon. As we conclude the holiday of Pesach, I hope it's a Chag Sameach for you. And again,
Chag Sameach to all of our viewers.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. The thoughts of Jonathan Tobin, the senior online editor of Commentary Magazine, as he says, for the Jewish community, this is the moral issue of our time. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, to the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.